racism, terrorism, alcoholism, radicalisation, teenage pregnancy, suicide, and public executions. They're all inside this children's book. When I first picked this up, I thought it was a dystopian YA about a dodgy romance disguised as a racially charged political drama. Then I looked at the cover and realised it was actually a children's book. Then I read it, and I realised I was right the first time. Noughts Crosses is about a world torn apart by segregation, except here it is the white people, or Noughts, who are oppressed, and the non-white, or Crosses, who oppress them. It follows Sephi, the daughter of a powerful Cross politician, and her childhood friend Callum, a Nought whose family is falling into the throes of a radical terrorist group called the Liberation Militia. The story begins when Callum starts school at Heathcroft as one of the first and few Nought students to be allowed to attend a cross school, and the political backlash this has on both sides. This is a book with many merits, but there were also a few issues. But first, let's look at what it did well. So all joking aside, this book did a pretty fair job at handling a lot of the darker subjects. Issues like alcoholism, suicide, radicalisation, and of course racism were all very prevalent and written about maturely. I can't say how accurate they are, as obviously they're not issues that I've really struggled with or experienced, but they didn't strike me as obviously inaccurate. And either way, for a younger readership, it did a good job at introducing these elements without overloading. Following on from this, Blackman, the author, hasn't shied away from brutality. People are hurt, people are killed, they are murdered and executed and beaten to death. And you do get a real sense of how brutal and unfair this world is, and how the hatred built up on both sides is destroying the lives of the innocent. Many things happen that are beyond the control of the main characters, and there isn't an easy fix or solution. They just have to accept and deal with the fact that life is unfair, and that some people suck, and if those sucky people have power, they can make life even worse for everyone around them. I also appreciate the nuanced view of good and evil, with neither side being painted as strictly the good or the bad guys. Now obviously in situations like this, you're going to sympathise with the Noughts as a whole and not the Crosses, because the Noughts are the ones being oppressed, being robbed of rights and being treated with disdain and cruelty because of the colour of their skin, which is terrible. But when we look at the host of characters as individuals, not as racist or not racist, we see that there are Crosses who are decent and ready to accept change and embrace a more equal world. And we see Noughts who are so twisted and bitter that any cross blood spilt is victory, regardless of who that cross is. The Liberation Militia, whilst on paper fighting for a good cause, do commit objectively evil acts. I also enjoyed how Sephi, the rich cross girl, whilst being a very kind person who obviously isn't overtly racist, is still a product of her upbringing, and does have to tackle her inner demons and implicit racism. She doesn't think Noughts are evil or disgusting, but she does still use a derogatory slur, and has to atone for her behaviour. I also just thought there were some pretty cool ideas and some nice little tidbits in here. For example, during school, Callum answers a few questions about inventors and scientists and whatnot. And the final question asked is, what do all these people have in common? And of course the answer is, they are all Crosses. But the people mentioned in this are all real, like, scientists, inventors, famous figures. But they're all people of colour, which I thought was a really nice little touch. I didn't realise until Malorie Blackman actually points out in a little note at the end. There was also a small theme of religion, which mentions like the Bible or the Holy Book, and talks about like who's religious and who isn't. It wasn't utilised particularly well, and I dare say didn't add a huge amount to the overall story, but there were some ideas presented which I thought were interesting, and perhaps this is explored a little more in the other two books of the trilogy. Let's start with the small things. Firstly, it is a tad melodramatic at times. I understand the characters are all angsty teenagers, and it's a very dramatic setting and all that, but there were a lot of moody reactions which got boring quickly. Secondly, the romance is really not that great. which is curious because the romance is meant to be the driving force behind the two leads. Like in Romeo and Juliet, it is used to show the injustice of the world and how the tensions between society at large can damage the lives of the new and innocent generation. So that the romance could have been a bit better. It was a bit. I bought them more as friends, to be honest. And thirdly, the style doesn't suit the audience, I think. The themes are far too mature for children, but the prose is too childish for teenagers. This book is advertised as children's fiction, having won a few children's book awards, although it is specified as not being suitable for younger readers. And it came out in, I think, around 2001, which is decades after the genre YA was coined. And yet, with its teenage cast, mature themes, and heavy romance, I'm really surprised this is still considered children's fiction. It's not too bad for most of the book, although it definitely pushes it with its more brutal content and the French kissing, which is gross, and I don't enjoy reading about anyway, but I especially didn't like the French kissing between a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. But then we get to the last section when the characters are older, and I think it is far too adult to be considered children's fiction. But I'll get onto that later. This book is obviously geared towards teenagers, with its romantic subplot, heavy themes and teenage characters, but it's written in a way that I would call a little patronising, with like lots of exclamation marks in a row, for instance. A more formal writing style might have conveyed the themes a little better, as they currently feel a bit flippant at times. So I just want to talk about two things. And these are big things, so if you actually are going to read this book, stop watching, because a part of the enjoyment was not knowing what was going to happen. It was very tense, especially near the end. So really stop watching if you're going to read it. Firstly, I want to commend the fact that this book had the balls to kill off one of the lead characters at the end. Like, I honestly thought this character was going to survive. They were going to find some way last minute to let them escape. But no! Dead. Rip. So I've got to acknowledge that. Secondly, the romance being a bit dodge and the genre being a little confused all culminated in a sex scene near the end of the book. Yeah, a sex scene in a children's book. Now, it's not explicit in any way. It's more of one of those tasteful kind of fade to black affairs, but still. My big issue was actually the stuff surrounding this scene. So for context, Sephi is 17 or 18 and Callum's about 19. And they haven't seen each other for about 3 years or so, with Sephi being at boarding school and dreaming of being a lawyer to fight for equality and all that. And Callum has been inducted into the Liberation Militia, the terrorist group, and is also trying to bring about equality with a lot more murder. Callum lures Sephi to their usual meeting spot with a letter. Then he and his team kidnap her and to hold her for ransom because her father's a high-up figure. So he's quite mean to her. She feels very betrayed by him because, he wants to meet up and then kidnapped her, tied her up. He cut her thumb, I think, to get blood on her jumper to send to her father so they mean business, and make her read out the ransom message so that he knows that she's definitely been kidnapped and all that stuff. And she's locked in this cell and it's cold and she's alone and she gets disgusting food and it's all awful. And while the team are off actually obtaining the ransom and he's left alone to guard her, he goes to her cell and then they just sort of randomly start kissing, and he tells her that he loves her, and she just sort of lets him go to town on her, and it just rubbed me the wrong way. From her point of view, her childhood friend and sweetheart has betrayed her entirely, kidnapped her, and then despite claiming to love her, he still refuses to let her go. So I just didn't like it. It was just weird and came out of nowhere. And also because the sort of few years passed very quickly, I hadn't quite gotten used to her as being 17. In my head, she was still about 13 or 14, which just made it even weirder. And then she was crying afterwards because she realised that she loved him. And I was just no, you may have loved him or thought you loved him once, but only, I think, an idiot or someone who's been brainwashed or gaslit and emotionally abused would actually think this is love after he kidnapped and attacked her. And she having just come back from boarding school with dreams of becoming a lawyer, is clearly not an idiot and has not been emotionally abused since she was a teenager because her parents sucked as well. So I just really didn't think that fit, and it was just nasty. I didn't like it. Nope. All in all, it's a pretty good read. I don't quite know who I'd recommend it to. I suppose middling teenagers would be the best range, where the themes are things they will have encountered in the news and on social media and all that. But hopefully they're not so old that the prose style is too patronising for them. But I did enjoy it, and once I got over the prose and sort of understood, yeah, it's written for younger people than me, it was quite gripping, especially at the end, and it is quite tense, so I did enjoy it. So yeah, that's all my thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Ciao!